Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It is good to be with you on this Monday, January 10th. Here is some of what we're talking about tonight. Stopping COVID could depend on vaccinating developing countries. We will meet the medical team that may have figured out another way to get that done. Russia and the U.S. begin days of talks over the future of Ukraine. But what is this really about? And how likely is another Russian invasion? A former U.S. ambassador breaks it down for us. Deadly fires in New York and Philadelphia are raising plenty of questions. The Biden administration's top fire prevention official joins us live. Then Novak Djokovic is one step closer to chasing a tennis record after a ruling on Australia's vaccine rules. So what happens now? And a new look at the impact of slavery on Congress. You might not believe how recently a slaveholder served in the Senate. What an honor to be back for my first show of the new year. No one is happier to be back than I am, because last week we got canceled by COVID after I tested positive, but I tested negative today. So here we are back in Studio 6E, and I was just one of the many people who got caught up in this wave of Omicron variant cases. My souvenir from a week-long vacation in South Florida. Now, by our count, the U.S. is up to 61 million cases since the pandemic began. Catching positive cases, like mine, is one key to fighting COVID. That could get a bit easier after two announcements from the White House. If you haven't heard these yet, definitely listen up. First of all, the administration says that free at-home COVID tests should be available to order online this month. We should get details this week on exactly how to order them. Second, starting this Saturday, private insurance companies will have to cover the kits that you buy for yourself. Private plans must either cover or reimburse up to 8 home tests per person per month. That means that Americans will be able to either get kits for free under their insurance plans or submit receipts as long as you stay within the monthly limit. Again, that's up to 8 kits per person per month starting this Saturday. Testing is a huge issue in getting kids back in school, especially in some of the nation's largest districts. Today, public schools in Chicago were canceled for the 4th day in a row. The Chicago Teachers Union says the city is not doing enough to ensure a safe return to campus. Mayor Lori Lightfoot has called the closures an illegal walkout. Chicago is just one district struggling with COVID closures. Officials in Philadelphia and Oregon and Minneapolis and New Jersey are also trying to reopen and stay open. But that's here in the U.S., a wealthy nation with vaccines just about everywhere. What about in countries that have much bigger struggles? On that front, there may also be some good news. Keeping vaccination rates up means we might keep ahead of COVID-19's mutations. Omicron is not the last one, and whatever comes next could be more like the aggressive Delta variant, or perhaps worse. But 2 medical researchers have developed a vaccine to help close that gap. One of them joins us tonight, and he is a familiar face. Dr. Peter Hotez is the co-director of the Center for Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital. He is also the dean at the National School of Tropical Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Hotez, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Great to see you, Joshua. Glad you're feeling better.
I am so glad that I'm feeling better, too, especially to talk to you about this news. Tell us about this vaccine called Corbevax. What is Corbevax?
So at our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, I like to say we make the vaccines that the big pharma companies are not interested in making because they're not money makers. We make vaccines for neglected tropical diseases of poverty, parasitic infections such as Chagas disease and schistosomiasis for the poorest regions of Latin America and Africa. And then about 10 years ago, we started developing coronavirus vaccines because they were orphaned too. Nobody cared about them back then. And it's kind of interesting for our approach for all of our vaccines. Our health economists say if we have to charge more than $2 or $3 a dose, you might as well not make them because they're for the world's poorest people. So all of our processes use low-cost approaches, and we use that same approach for our SARS and MERS vaccine. And when the COVID-19 sequence hit, we did the same thing, and we made it. We made a very exciting vaccine older technology similar to that used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that's been in use for 4 decades, that parents have been giving to their kids in the United States, for instance, for 4 decades. And the big game changer is that technology, that ability to scale up those types of vaccines is in place, and you name it, in Brazil and Indonesia and Bangladesh and Vietnam. And so we developed that technology and transferred it to India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Botswana so far. No patent, no strings attached, to make it easy breezy as possible. And now the Indian government just announced that they've got emergency use authorization by the Indian regulators. They have 150 million doses ready to go, and they'll make 1 billion doses in the next few months. And so we're going to vaccinate the world when no one else will.
And I just want to be clear in what we're talking about. This is different technology than the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, these mRNA vaccines. This is kind of an older technology that's still applicable to COVID-19.
That's right. And it seems actually to work about as well from what we could see from the virus neutralizing antibodies and the T cell responses. The difference is no limits to the amount you can scale. There's no learning curve because it's already in place across the world. And we took patents off the table. Simple refrigeration, no limit to the amount you can make. And it really does check all of the boxes that you would want for a vaccine for COVID-19. Release for emergency use authorization in adults 18 and over, but now we have the clinical trials going on in kids, and we're also got clinical trials going on as a booster. Because, you know, Joshua, we have this problem. Delta arose out of an unvaccinated population in India earlier last year, and then Omicron arose out of an unvaccinated population in Southern Africa. And Mother Nature's telling us what she has in store for us. We're going to have another major variant come this summer after we get through Omicron, unless we make a commitment to vaccinate the world. And now our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, our modest-sized research institute, is making more vaccine for low and middle-income countries than the U.S. government or any other G7 country. And we're happy to have that role, but we need the others to step up.
Well, with regards to that, I wonder how that fits into the overall timeline for beating back COVID, if indeed we can beat back COVID. Dr. Albert Bourla, who's the CEO of Pfizer, was on CNBC today, and here's what he said. It caught one of our producers by surprise. Here's what he said about the timeline that he sees for getting COVID under something resembling control. Watch.
That because we will have everyone vaccinated and everyone, all of the rest of the people diseased, we will control, let's say, within the next 10 years, this virus. I believe it will continue to be present because it's spread everywhere, and because both natural infection and vaccinations seems to produce not very durable immune protection. So it's going to be coming again and again, but we can have it perfectly controlled.
10 years, Dr. Hotez? Are we really talking about dealing with the ups and downs of COVID surges and vaccines and shutdowns for 10 more years? How do you see it?
Well, as long as we have to pay billions of dollars to vaccinate the world, it will be 10 years, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here's what we need to do. We need to vaccinate the world's low and middle income countries before the next variant arises. And it's doable. Here's what needs to be done. There are 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, almost 1 billion in Latin America, another 1 billion in the world's low and middle income countries in Southeast Asia. It's 3 billion people. We need 9 billion doses, and we can't wait that 10 years to do this through mRNA technology. We can do it now with simpler technology that, from what we can see, is looking good and may even be more durable than some of the mRNA vaccines. But we need resolve from the G7 leaders. We need, President Biden got up there at the end of the year and boasted how the U.S. government has provided 275 million doses, more than any other country. Well, heck, we just did that with our Center for Vaccine Development, and that's more than any of the other G7 countries. So this defeatist attitude and this, being kind of asleep at the wheel, we need to be able to vaccinate the world. We can. And if the G7 leaders aren't willing to do it, we'll do it here in our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development.
A few other things I want to ask you about before I have to let you go. We mentioned that school systems across the country, some big city school systems, are struggling to get back in sessions. There's still all these concerns about, you know, whether it's safe to bring teachers back on campus, whether there's enough testing, enough access to masks, and so on. How do you see that in terms of where we are with getting kids vaccinated, with the increasing approvals for vaccines for different age groups, and then with just the efforts that different communities have undertaken, or not perhaps, to get COVID under control? How do you see us in terms of getting schools back to normal?
Well, we've underachieved in terms of vaccinating our kids overall. So if you look first at the teenagers, 12 to 17, about 75% are vaccinated in the Northeast. Not perfect, but getting there. But here in the South and in Texas, it's about half that. So we're essentially not vaccinating our teenagers. Then when you look at the little kids, 5 and up, we're talking about maybe 15% of the little kids have been vaccinated. So parents are holding back to vaccinate their kids with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So we've got to fix that and repair some of the vaccine hesitancy. And we still don't have a path for the little kids yet. So that's problem one. You know, right now, school superintendents, school boards are really struggling because, as I've said, it's a choice between a bad decision and a bad decision. Because the bad decision, number one, is we keep kids with virtual learning, and we know the mental health effects of that, and the Surgeon General has articulated this beautifully, the mental health aspects of not having kids in school. On the other hand, we also have data that says 1 in 7 kids who get COVID have long COVID, and possibly inducing diabetes, and teachers getting sick. So how do you keep the kids safe? So there's no good decision here, and I have a great amount of empathy and sympathy for whatever the school boards ultimately make.
One last thing, by far the top story on NBCnews.com today for quite a while was about the cold weather that's about to blow through the upper Midwest and the Northeast. It's already begun to come through, with more people congregating inside. And with the increased concern about both COVID and flu season, what would you say to folks? I mean, this seems like sort of a perfect scenario, more people inside to stay warm, for COVID to move more easily. What do we do? Where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, you know, we've seen these big COVID peaks in the South in the summer and big peaks in the winter in the North. And people are saying that's due to seasonality and the fact that people are being exposed more. And I go through this with good colleagues like Mike Osterholm and others, and we don't really know the basis for seasonality yet for COVID-19. But no question, we're seeing co-infections with flu. We saw that at the very beginning with the outbreak in Wuhan, combined flu and COVID co-infections. And don't forget, it's not just that. We've also got respiratory syncytial virus, which is an important problem of kids. And we have adenovirus. And by the way, historically, when measles epidemics occurred, they occurred late winter, early spring. And the anti-vaccine movement may be having spillover effects against other childhood vaccinations. So this is going to be a very challenging next few months in terms of navigating these virus pathogens.
And bear in mind, you know, if you want to get vaccinated, you can do it quickly, quietly. No one has to know but you and your doctor. You can go to planyourvaccine.com. We're happy to help point you toward information that'll help get you and your family vaccinated. Dr. Peter Hotez, always good talking to you, sir. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua.
Still to come, another standoff between the U.S. and Russia. But this week, they're standing face to face. The two countries held almost 8 hours of talks today. Former Ambassador Michael McFaul joins us to break down what they want and what happens now. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Invading another country is usually an act of war. The U.S. and NATO are holding talks with Russia in hopes of preventing it from invading any more of Ukraine. But if it does, then what? Ukraine borders Russia. Since November, 100,000 Russian troops have stationed along that border, those areas in red on the map. No wonder the West is worried about a mass invasion. Back in 2014, Russia took the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. Today, the U.S. and Russia engaged in nearly 8 hours of talks. Western allies hope to prevent history from repeating itself. But why? Is Ukraine really such a big deal to the U.S.? National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan suggests that it very much is. Here's part of what he told Lester Holt in a Nightly News exclusive.
We believe that the Russians have positioned tens of thousands of troops and advanced military equipment on the border with Ukraine, and that they have done so with at least the capability, if not the intention, to invade. We believe the threat of invasion is real, and we are determined through a combination of deterrence and diplomacy to avert that circumstance, to defend Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty, and to convince the Russians that the right course to go down is a course of diplomacy rather than a course of conflict.
Let's dive into this with NBC News national security and international affairs analyst Michael McFaul. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, it's good to see you again, and I wonder if you could just start by telling us what you made of today's talks. The sense I got was that this was just kind of a curtain raiser, sort of setting the table for everything. Each side got to lay out what's on their mind, and then potentially more substantive action-oriented talks come after this. But is that what happened?
I think that's exactly right. There was no real negotiations being done. In fact, Wendy Sherman, the head of the American delegation, basically said that. What they were trying to do, I think the Biden administration was trying to do, is to figure out does Putin and the Russian government actually want to negotiate about European security matters? And if so, it sounds like the Biden team is ready to talk about lots of things. Some things they're not willing to talk about, like, sanctions and no more NATO expansion. But on many other things, they hinted that they were, and they wanted to hear from Mr. Ribkov. You're showing him right there. I used to deal with him on a weekly basis when I was the U.S. ambassador. They wanted to hear from him. Are they serious? And I don't think they figured that out yet. I think they heard enough to suggest there might be real negotiations, but not enough to convince them completely of that.
Let's talk about sanctions. First of all, here's a quick clip from Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman, who's leading the U.S. delegation, and part of what she said about the possibility of more sanctions. Watch.
If Russia further invades Ukraine, there will be significant costs and consequences well beyond what happened in 2014. Those sanctions will include key financial institutions, export controls that target key industries, enhancements of NATO force posture on allied territory, and increased security assistance to Ukraine.
So, Ambassador McFaul, how much of a stick does the U.S. have to deal with Russia, since I'm not sure how much carrot is left on the table if we're talking about sanctions? And also, in light of what you and I have discussed in the past, that this is really about Vladimir Putin and what he wants out of this whole engagement. I don't know what sanctions would do to deter him from whatever his aims are with Ukraine.
I don't know either. And I don't think anybody knows, just to be clear. President Biden doesn't know. CIA Director Burns doesn't know. Deputy Secretary Sherman doesn't know. I don't even think Ribkov knows. I don't think Putin has made it clear what his endgame is here, and whether he is just doing all this kabuki dancing to get ready for invasion, or whether he actually wants to have a negotiation. I do, however, think it is right by the Biden administration, most explicitly spelled out today by Deputy Secretary Sherman, to make that a costly decision should he decide to do it. Raising the costs of military intervention, I think, is a good thing. And I'm glad she spelled out that list that had not been said, by the way, publicly until today.
With regards to what happens now, NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is in eastern Ukraine, where there are Ukrainian forces kind of standing up in case something happens with Russian forces across the border. Let's hear part of Richard's report, and then I'll ask you about it on the other side. Watch.
Here in eastern Ukraine, Ukrainian troops are digging new trenches. It is slow, incredibly backbreaking work. They have to chip right into the frozen ground, and these trenches go on for miles. And the reason that they are preparing for the worst now is that they worry that negotiations between the United States and Russia could either fail, or that Russia is not negotiating in good faith, that Russia is just going through the motions of diplomacy so that it can claim that it gave peace a chance and then invade this country again anyway.
That's NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel reporting. Now, Ambassador, these talks are happening about Ukraine without Ukraine. What does Ukraine want out of all of this, other than presumably Russia not to invade? But in a bigger sense, like, what does Ukraine want?
First, I just got to say, let's give it up to Richard Engel. He's a fantastic correspondent that he's literally in the trenches reporting today. I deeply admire what he does to help bring these stories to us. Secondly, it's a great question. First of all, the Ukrainians don't like the fact that they're not at that meeting. Officials I've talked to, former officials, they're quiet because they want to be in good standing with the United States. But you wouldn't like it either, by the way, if some country was deciding the fate of America without us being at the table. But number two, of course, like you said, the first thing they want is they don't want military intervention, but they also don't want to be having negotiations that somehow tie their future, especially about NATO, especially about joining the European Union. And most certainly, they don't want to create an impression that we're going back to the 19th century or the 20th century, where great powers had spheres of influence, and we're going to allow that to happen vis-a-vis Russia towards Ukraine. So that's hard because, you know, a lot of countries don't think we have a stake in this game, and a lot of Americans are thinking, like you said, why do we care about Ukraine? And yet, if we allow that to happen, I think that creates a very dangerous precedent. Let's not forget that when we thought that between World War I and World War II, that ended with, again, starting World War II. And so they don't want to be left out of this debate. They want to have a say in the future of their own country and their own sovereignty.
And let's be clear, Ukraine is not on the, it's not like Ukraine is going to get approved into NATO tomorrow. Like, there are other issues in Ukraine, including dealing with just corruption in their government that their current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that he's going to deal with. So that's on the horizon, but not an impossibility. I know I got to let you go in a second, but let's talk about where this goes from here. The Russians are meeting with NATO on Wednesday, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on Thursday. So there are more meetings going on this week. How do we gauge the value of these meetings, the impact of them? It feels like it's an obvious chance for each side to kind of rattle sabers at the other, except they're just doing it in each other's faces as opposed to virtually. But how do we measure success from these meetings, for lack of a better word? Is it just the absence of an invasion, or is there more to it than that?
Well, first, Joshua, you just said something really, really important. I want to underscore it. There is no threat. There's no negotiation. There's no right around the corner, Ukraine is joining NATO. Putin entirely invented that script, that idea. And as we debate NATO expansion, that means we're not talking about his intervention in eastern Ukraine, his annexation of Crimea. So I'm glad you made that point first. Second, I don't expect a lot from these two talks. That it'll be important to have the NATO conversation, and OSCE, of course, is important because that's the one place where Ukraine is a member and Russia is a member. But I think this will just be a replay of what happened today, and then we're going to have to wait and see. We're going to have to wait to hear from Putin. Is he serious about negotiations? And if he is, then we're in business. I think there could be a long, prolonged negotiation with Europeans that would be good for Europe, good for the United States, good for Ukraine, good for Russia. But we're going to have to wait and see if Putin's serious. Today, I would say we still don't know the answer to that question.
NBC News analyst and former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Ambassador, always good talking to you, sir. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Up next, we'll shift gears to Australia, where a very different kind of diplomacy is at play. Tennis star Novak Djokovic might get to play in the Australian Open after all. That's just ahead. Stay close. So what do you think? Should Novak Djokovic get to play in the Australian Open? It seems that Australia will let him stay and defend his Grand Slam title, at least for now. Last week, Australian border officials canceled Mr. Djokovic's visa. A federal judge there ruled that the officials acted unreasonably by not giving him enough time to make his case. Novak Djokovic provided evidence of testing positive for COVID last month. That was enough for tennis officials to grant a medical exemption. But once he arrived, Australian border officials said that he did not meet the requirements for entry. According to a government transcript, he told officials that he is not vaccinated. Djokovic spent 4 nights in isolation at an immigration detention hotel. After his release, he tweeted that he does plan to compete at next week's Australian Open. But that might not be up to him. Australia's immigration minister still has the power to cancel his visa again. Joining us to discuss it is Dan Wolken, a sports columnist with USA Today. Mr. Wolken, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
To talk about what the next steps are from here. First of all, when is the Australian Open, and how much time is there in the window between when the Open begins and when a decision's got to be made about Novak Djokovic?
Yeah, the tournament starts next Monday in Australia, which would be basically Sunday afternoon, evening in the United States. The draw for the tournament is coming up in the next day or two. So certainly for Tennis Australia, which runs the event, they'd like to have an answer about whether or not he's going to play. As of right now, this very moment, it seems he is. But like we talked about many, many times over this saga, it is changing literally by the hour. It's Tuesday in Australia right now. We're waiting to see if the immigration minister is going to cancel his visa again and whether that would end up back in court for a second time. If that's the decision, then yeah, this could go on for several more days, but it's a wild situation. It's something that nobody's ever seen in a tennis tournament before.
And let's just be clear, the organization that oversees the Australian Open, it's Tennis Australia, but it's not like an Australian government organization. It's sort of the sanctioning body that's not really part of the Australian government, right? These are two different groups.
Yeah, but part of the issue with why this has gotten so confusing is Tennis Australia works very closely with the government of the state of Victoria, especially during the COVID pandemic. Last year, same thing with the players coming in when there was a lot of lockdowns and things going on in Australia, to set the ground rules, to basically say, listen, here's what the players need to do. All of the players were under the impression that they were going to have to be vaccinated to enter the country for this year's Australian Open, and that the exemptions were going to be extremely limited. Djokovic got an exemption from the state of Victoria and from the tournament working together. Where this has sort of hit the snag is that it's not necessarily enough to meet the requirements for entry into the country, which is a federal issue. So it's federal versus state here. And not to get too deep into the politics in Australia, but those two entities are controlled by different parties, and it's an election year in Australia, and this has really sort of put Djokovic in the middle of a political fight.
You see that tweet there from Scott Morrison of Australia saying that rules are rules, especially when it comes to our borders. That mirrors a lot of what you told us online about how you view what's happening with Novak Djokovic. Simone wrote the rules should apply to everyone. Allison asked, why are rules modified for him when all others must comply? Although, Dan Wolken, it sounds like the rules weren't necessarily modified for him. There was an official decision that was made that presumably would apply to other players. But what about that? I mean, how much of this is just a matter of flat-out fairness, and how much of this is potentially a situation where you might not get this same consideration if your name was not Novak Djokovic and you were trying to break a record for Grand Slam wins?
You can understand from the standpoint of people in Australia, Melburnians, who have arguably had the harshest restrictions during the COVID pandemic of any city in the world. A lot of lockdowns, I think 260 plus days. The city of Melbourne has actually been locked down over the last couple of years. You've got Australians who were out of the country who had almost impossible time getting back into Australia. You've had within the country, you have to have special permission from the government to move around, to go from one state to the next. A lot of those requests have been denied for people who say, wanted to see a relative who was sick, dying in a hospital, something like that. So you can totally understand the anger locally nationally in Australia about a guy like Djokovic trying to come to the country unvaccinated. They've had 90+% of their eligible citizens vaccinated, and the players on the ATP tour, because of this idea that they were going to have to be vaccinated to go to Australia, were up to 95% of the top 100 who got vaccinated. Yeah. So, for all the issues surrounding this, the easiest thing for Djokovic to have done would have just been to get the vaccine. And then it's very easy for him to get in the country, move around the world, and play tennis. The fact that this has gotten so complicated, there's certainly nobody looks good in this whole situation, but ultimately it's on him and his decision not to get the vaccine.
We should also note, as I mentioned, that Novak Djokovic is tied with Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal for the most men's Grand Slam wins in his career. They're all tied at 20. I would be stunned if he wasn't trying to break that record for himself. The next nearest is Pete Sampras with 14 wins. Could you just touch, before I have to let you go, on just the importance of this tournament? I mean, is he favored to win? Is he favored to do well? Like, what's the good money right now in terms of whether or not he's most likely to claim that title? Yeah. Before we go.
Djokovic has won 3 of the last 4 Grand Slams last year. He's won the Australian Open 9 times. He's going to be 35 years old this year, which for a tennis player is sort of getting to the end of his career. But just sort of given the form he was in last year, the fact that he has been more successful in Australia than any other tournament they play, absolutely, he's the favorite coming in. And this is a huge opportunity for him to break that record, to, for the first time in his career, have the all-time lead for most Grand Slam titles, which is certainly something he wants to do, not just break that record, but put distance between himself and Federer and Nadal so that he is considered the greatest of all time. There's certainly a lot of debate about that in tennis circles, but in terms of the statistics and the numbers, this is a big tournament for him, and that's why he's fighting so hard to play in it.
Last 10 seconds, very, very, very briefly. Has he ever said why he's not vaccinated, briefly?
No, I mean, Djokovic has got some very interesting beliefs, a lot of holistic medicine and things like that, things that would be considered, I would say, fringe. But yeah, there's no real answer for that other than just he's a little bit of a contrarian with some odd beliefs.
Dan Wolken, sports columnist with USA Today. We appreciate you coming by to talk us through this. Thanks very much.
You got it. Thank you.
First in Philadelphia, then in New York. We'll have the latest on 2 deadly fires, each killing at least a dozen people, including children. FEMA's top fire prevention official joins us when we come back. Tonight, we're following 2 devastating fires in the Northeast. One fire broke out yesterday in New York after a space heater caught fire. At least 17 people died, including 8 children. More than a dozen people were listed in critical condition. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, at least 12 people are dead, including 9 children, after a city-owned row house caught fire. Officials say none of that building's smoke detectors was working. Both fires are still under investigation, but NBC's Gabe Gutierrez is in the Bronx with more on that fire's aftermath.
A heartbreaking cleanup effort and investigation is underway after New York City's deadliest fire in decades. At this point, there are still a lot of questions about why smoke was able to travel so far up this 19-story apartment building, 120 units, and authorities say that victims were found on every floor. Now, a lot of the investigation will now focus on this door on the 2nd and 3rd floor apartments that was somehow left open, even though all the doors inside the building were supposed to be self-closing. At least that's according to a spokesperson for the ownership group that runs the building. They say that the main apartment that caught fire had last been checked back in July and that everything was in working order. So there's a lot of questions about how exactly that door remained open and how the smoke was able to travel throughout the building. The owner of the building also says that there was a working smoke alarm system, even though some residents say that the fire alarms went off so often that residents often ignored it. The owner of the building says that sometimes residents would smoke in the stairwells and trip the fire alarm. So that's also part of the investigation. But this has been a heartbreaking scene here in the Bronx. Several children lost their lives here, and this community is still coming to terms with this. The governor of New York says a compensation fund for the victims will be started.
Thank you, Gabe. That was NBC's Gabe Gutierrez reporting from the Bronx. So what do we know about the fire dangers we face today? And what should you do in case of disaster? Let's continue now with Dr. Lori Moore Merrill. She is the head of the U.S. Fire Administration, which is part of FEMA. Dr. Moore Merrill, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I want to underscore that both of these fires are still very much under investigation, and I don't want to presume links between these fires where none has been established. With that said, I wonder what your impressions are of these two fires so far, the one in Philadelphia and the one in New York, especially in light of what we know about how fires like this start.
I can tell you that they are devastating. And to have two fires with this number of fatalities is unimaginable. And we're seeing them in smaller numbers in other places. In fact, we are approaching nearly 100 nationwide in just these few days into 2022. And so astronomical numbers, and they are devastating, particularly for the firefighters who have to respond, doing everything they can and still have these outcomes.
I understand that there's some new research about the impact of space heaters on fires like this. A space heater is implicated in the fire in the Bronx that Gabe Gutierrez was reporting on. As I understand it, a new study shows that 41% of deadly fires like this are caused by space heaters. Now, when I see that, I think there's a space heater in the room because the heat isn't working, right? You don't need a space heater in an apartment that has proper HVAC in it. How much of this is the issue in terms of the space heaters themselves as the object being the problem as opposed to something larger structural with a building?
So our data, unfortunately, are limited in this arena. But what we know from 2017 to 2019 is that there were an average of 1,100 portable space heater fires in residential buildings annually. This has caused more than 65 deaths, 150 injuries, and 51 million in property damage annually. So those are in the years reported from 2017 to 2019. And so we often know that it is first item ignited is something close to the space heater. So it is often the space heater itself, but it is often also what it is placed beside. We have to be cognizant of putting space heaters not near things that are going to burn.
Let me play a clip of one of the survivors of this fire in the Bronx who talked about trying to get out and watching others who were trying to escape. Watch.
It got to the point that at the last minute we couldn't breathe.
And the people were in all the window crying for help, help, help. No fire escape.
Let's talk about what people should know if they find themselves, God forbid, in a situation like this, especially if they're in the kind of a building where fire escape access or stairwell access is either difficult or non-existent. What should people know?
So first of all, we want to have those smoke detectors, working smoke detectors. And we want to make sure that if at all possible, there are sprinklers in the building. We know that automatic suppression systems work. We have no fatalities or rarely fatalities in buildings with sprinklers. We also want to make sure that people have an escape route, that they know how to get out of the building and that they practice that. That is imperative. Don't just assume that the stairwells are open. Don't just assume that the doors are unlocked. So we want to make sure they have an escape route. We also want to make sure that they close doors. And this is not just closing doors when you know there's a fire happening and you're escaping, right? Close the door behind you. That we know will make a difference. But also closing your doors at night when you go to bed. close your doors in your home. Make sure that you have that break should something happen in your home, should you have a fire in your home. We know that limiting the airflow, limiting the fuel supply to fires that do occur works. We can stop it. We can stop the fatalities if we can stop the flow of air, if we can stop the fuel that is feeding the fire. And so, again, smoke detectors, making sure you have an escape route, making sure that you close doors, whether, regardless of fire, close your doors when you sleep, and make sure that if you are going to use a space heater, please keep it at least 3 feet from anything that can burn.
I also got to ask you just about the demographic aspect of this. I mean, you look at where this fire happened in the Bronx, the fire in North Philadelphia. There was a Consumer Product Safety Commission study that found that Black Americans are the most likely of any racial or ethnic group to be injured or die in a fire. How do we just deal with that aspect of this? It's hard not to look at these fires and say on some level, this is a level of societal neglect that affects certain demographics more than others, and that's just kind of the way it's always been.
It is unfortunate that equity certainly plays a role in this scenario. And I mentioned sprinklers, for example, and we, in the fire service, we are constantly battling, and it's always about funding. It's always about money and the expense of sprinklered buildings. It is imperative that we continue that fight, however. It is also unfortunate that public housing is often affected by these types of events. And this is something that at some point we're going to have the hard discussions about the real value of a life. And so in the fire service, as I said, we focus on prevention. We focus on keeping that ignition from occurring. And we want to make sure that, the fire service is ready to respond, but we'd certainly prefer that these events not occur to begin with.
I think the first thing that a lot of us can do is just think through the route. I mean, I'm here on the 6th floor of 30 Rock. I live in a multi-story apartment building here in Manhattan, and I'm trying to think to myself, if something happened in the studio right now, how would I get out? I think I know my route. I've never actually walked it. So maybe that's something I should do very soon. Maybe that's something we should all do very soon. Dr. Lori Moore-Merrill is the U.S. Fire Administrator under FEMA. Dr. Moore-Merrill, I appreciate you talking us through this. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you for having me.
Pop quiz. How many members of Congress in its history owned slaves? This question had no reliable answer until today, thanks to a new project from the Washington Post. We'll show you before we go. Here's a historical figure that we think you should know about. This is Rebecca Latimer Felton. She was the first woman in the United States Senate. Georgia's governor appointed her after the incumbent died. Ms. Felton served for one day, November 21st, 1922, almost 100 years ago. Her one Senate speech focused on the equality of the sexes. She was a suffragist. But she was definitely not an abolitionist. Rebecca Latimer Felton was the last known senator who owned enslaved people. And her racism ran deep, including calls for mass lynchings to protect white women from black men. Quote, "If it takes lynching to protect women's dearest possession from drunken, ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 a week." Unquote. Senator Felton and her family held enslaved people for generations before the Civil War. How many more stories are there like hers? Members of Congress who profited from slavery. According to the Washington Post, more than 1,700 and counting. A new project is chronicling slaveholders in Congress. Today, the Post published its database, and now it wants your help to fill in the gaps. Joining us now is Washington Post reporter Julie Zosmer-Weil. She's part of the team working on this project. Ms. Weil, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
This database is fascinating. The story is absolutely fascinating. First of all, how did it come about?
Thank you. The idea actually came about in the summer of 2020 when Washington, D.C. did something that a number of cities have done, came up with a list of public buildings like schools and parks that the leaders who wrote the list thought should be renamed because of what the people whose names were on those buildings had done. And I was trying to figure out who these people were and realized many of them were in Congress. I Googled members of Congress who were slave owners and was very surprised to find out that there was no list.
Yeah, having lived in D.C. near the Van Ness metro station, which is near where my old station was, WAMU, I did not learn until I read your piece that station is named after a congressman from New York who owned slaves. So it's kind of amazing how deeply ingrained this is in so many parts of the district. Overall, though, are we talking about most members of Congress, a minority of members of Congress? Like, what's the proportion like of slaveholders to non-slave holders through history, at least as far as we know?
It's a great question. It really depends on what time period you're looking at. In the early years, when Congress was a brand new institution, more than half of all congressmen were slaveholders for the first 18 years or so. After that, the number goes down as the northern states stop sending so many slaveholders to Congress, but it continues for many decades longer. Even during the Civil War, when all of the southern congressmen secede, they're not in Congress anymore. At that point, fighting a war to end slavery, 20% of the congressmen in the U.S. Congress still are former or current enslavers.
How did you research this report? I believe you said that census records were a big part of it, but what else did you go on?
The census was by far the biggest part, but there were many other records. I looked at wills and tax records and plantation records, anything I could find, really. And there's still a lot that I haven't found. I was able to reach a conclusion about almost 5,000 congressmen, whether they were or were not slaveholders, but there are still over 600 who I'm looking for information on, and I'm hoping that people will be able to go to their local courthouse or historical society or maybe their own family genealogy and send me some of this information.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna ask our team to share out a link to the page where folks can send information. We'll share it out on social media. We are at NBC Now Tonight on all the major socials. I wonder what your perspective is on the value of this kind of information. There's been a lot of debate over the last year and a half over how we teach and talk about the legacy of slavery in America, whether it's the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1776 Commission, which the Trump administration created to create this kind of ahistorical history of the United States. How do you view the way that we teach and talk about slavery today, including things like this that we're still discovering?
Right. I mean, as I was working on this project, I came across so many stories that felt incomplete. There were stories like Charles Minor, for example, who there are books about him that say he was one of the early and fiercest advocates for ending slavery in D.C. What it doesn't mention is that I found the 1810 census, and it says that Charles Minor was a slaveholder at that time. So what happened in between, I don't know, because that part of the story hasn't been told. These stories are not complete.
New Jersey Democratic Senator Cory Booker spoke to your team about this database on slavery, and he noted part of what you said, which is that all around, that the Capitol is shaped by this legacy, as he put it, that we don't fully know or fully acknowledge. There's going to be a new statue in the National Statuary Hall very soon of Mayor McLeod Bethune, replacing a Confederate general who had represented Florida, some guy who I think was not even from the state of Florida. Before I have to let you go, where do you see this effort to kind of re-understand history going beyond the Washington Post's database? Is this part of a larger push, or are these one of kind of the only efforts that's going on? Before we go.
I really hope that it is part of a larger conversation. I'm hoping that historians will be able to use this to, when they're doing their analysis of what laws these early lawmakers made, this data can be useful to look at who was voting and how were they voting. I hope that those cities that are talking about whose name should be on buildings will look at this data and use it as a resource, and the conversation will continue.
This is so fascinating. And again, we'll share out the link for people if they have information that might be useful to identify the other 600 some odd members of Congress who have yet to be attributed. Julie Zosmer-Weil of the Washington Post, we appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for making time for us. Tomorrow night, we will dig into the controversy over 5G wireless service. Why are some airlines fighting this nationwide upgrade? And what is 5G anyway? Come on back for that and more tomorrow, and do bring a friend. Remember, you can stay in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and now on TikTok. We are at NBC Now tonight, everywhere on social. We welcome your questions and stories by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson, alive and well, glad to be back. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.